It might sound weird for me to say this, considering I'm recommending this game, but Everhood is one of the most frustrating games I have ever played. That isn't meant in the way that it usually is when talking about games. Everhood's greatest strength is its gameplay and all the well-crafted aesthetics that come along with that gameplay, and it certainly isn't frustrating, owing to a modular difficulty system that allows players to take the game at their own pace. There's little to complain about in that regard. However, Everhood is incredibly frustrating to me because of the sheer amount of potential that was absolutely squandered by the execution of its story. The concept behind this game's story is absolutely brilliant, the perfect mix of unique and engaging that kept me completely engrossed in its story for its runtime. And since the game's ending is its best moment, I think most people will leave very much satisfied with the experience. But after going through this game around 4 times, seeing every line of dialogue multiple times, and seeing every secret and every nook and cranny, I have to conclude that Everhood is, overall, a letdown in this regard. However, I have to make it clear that not only am I positive on the game overall, but I also believe most people will like the game more than me. If you forced me to put a score on it, I'd give it a 6, but that's down to things that I personally value that I understand most people won't value as highly. Even though that sounds like a low score, I was very satisfied with my purchase, especially considering the game's only $10. If you value good gameplay above all else, I can give Everhood to you as a very strong recommendation. Go and play the game right now if that sounds like you. But if you're not convinced, let's go into more detail. Looking at the Steam reviews for Everhood, you'll see Guitar Hero mentioned very often. I find this comparison to be laughable to the point of being misleading as to how this game plays. It superficially looks like Guitar Hero with the 5 lanes with notes, and generally the pace of the gameplay is dictated by the music. However, to compare this game to rhythm games would be very superficial. An important component of rhythm games is that player input is synced up to the music, thus the idea of rhythm in player input. In Everhood, the creation of the notes by the character the player is fighting is what is synced up to the music. Player inputs are not synced up to the music. Because of this, rhythm is not an important component of the game's gameplay, rather it's used for aesthetics. This is not a negative, I just want to make it clear that this is not a rhythm game. Aside from that, Everhood's combat system is one of the best examples of almost purely reflex-based gameplay I've seen in a while. When you break it down, it's incredibly simple. You have 2 options to avoid obstacles, moving and jumping, and you need to choose the best one when factoring other obstacles around you. Some obstacles can only be avoided by one option and not the other, which makes for enough possible combinations of obstacles to keep the game fresh for its 5 to 6 hour runtime. Additionally, at certain points in the game you have the ability to deflect certain obstacles, adding another option that additionally keeps things fresh during those parts of the game. It's simple, and it doesn't need anything more than what it already has to be enjoyable. And, as stated earlier, the game has modular difficulty, guaranteeing that everyone can move at their preferred pace through the game without running into a brick wall, along with additional challenge for those looking for that sort of thing. The enjoyment from these fights is accentuated by the game's presentation, which is used to make some truly exciting and surprising moments, which I would hate to spoil. At certain points, the visuals get truly psychedelic, which are consistently the most standout moments of the most standout fights, which also drives engagement considering how out of the ordinary those occurrences are. Even aside from that, characters are well animated, and attacks are easily readable and understood, which keep the visuals at a consistent quality throughout. It's at this point that I have to move into spoiler territory, which is also where I'll be the most critical. This is your last chance to leave to avoid major spoilers. The second half of Everhood marks a major turning point where the game greatly improves in a few key areas, but also where the game reveals its greatest flaws. Firstly, I didn't mention music in the non-spoiler section because much of the music present in the first half is strangely forgettable. The soundtrack definitely always fits and is consistent in its quality, but nothing really stands out. However, the game's second half is filled with standout tracks, with Revenge, The Final Battle, and Feisty Flowers being among my favorites. This is also the point at which the game introduces deflecting. By catching 2 notes of the same color, you can perform an attack, which allows the damaging of opponents during fights. This is a great moment of gameplay recontextualizing, which is a difficult technique to pull off. Firstly, notes being different colors actually has a gameplay purpose, which was a great surprise for me at least, as I thought they were just there for aesthetics. But on top of that, the rest of the game will be spent going back to old battles, but this time they have health bars that you need to use your new ability to take care of. Sadly, it's at this point where I run out of things to stall with, and I have to talk about the story. While it's not all bad, Everhood's story fails on multiple levels, and each level it fails on has an adverse effect on the others. Firstly, I failed to find a character in this game that I truly connected with. Many of them lack concrete characterization and end up being obnoxious joke dispensers, while those that don't fit that description tend to have about 2 to 3 conversations max. The only character that really breaks out of both these templates is Green Mage, who actually has concrete characterization with humor that is built off their character. I think it would have helped the relatability of the characters if they had something to say about each other or had relationships with each other. As it is, it feels like many of the characters live in separate worlds from each other's, despite the world being very small and having 30-40 people living in it. There are many characters that are literally never mentioned by anyone else, like Reese, which weakens the characters and the cohesion of the world. This also weakens the twist posited by Frog at the beginning of the second half. Here, it is revealed that the game's characters have inhabited this world for an incomprehensible amount of time. Even if they don't know they need it, they desperately need release. This is why you gain the ability to kill, to free souls. The objective at this point in the game is to kill everything. This concept that the game is built around, the idea of a world of immortals that need to be freed from suffering, is fantastic. It's an interesting moral dilemma as well. Do you take every character's life, even if it's against their wishes, because you know it's best for them? Maybe you don't think it's best for them, which the game can also account for, even though that route is a little bit too cryptic to trigger in my opinion. It's also very interesting that the kill everything route in the game actually gives you the good ending, which is the complete opposite of every other game I've played with this sort of choice in it. The unique concepts on display here were enough to keep me engaged all the way through the second half of the game. However, despite these ideas benefiting from being unique, they are dragged down by disappointing execution. The lack of concrete and identifiable characters makes that moral dilemma much less interesting because you barely know these people you have to kill, which misses out on a lot of emotion that could have been there. Additionally, many times when you do have to kill these characters, they seem pretty uncaring about the fact that they're about to be killed after many eons of life. If anything, they'll crack a joke before passing away, which is extremely tone-deaf compared to what would have made these moments more impactful. Maybe if this was the only concept Everhood's story focused on, I might find its flaws more permissible, but this game also decides to go for a meta-narrative. This is the part of the game that I cannot justify, as it is 1. Not original, 2. Takes away focus from the more interesting concept, and 3. Isn't expanded upon enough to be worth it. It successfully separates player from player character through the use of the word human to refer to the player rather than red the character, but following that, the dynamic between the player and their character is barely explored. I think an easy way to help this would have been to fully expand upon New Game Plus, which is very disappointing in terms of new content as it is in the game now. It would have greatly benefited from a more interesting twist, with the best idea I could think of as having the player start as Pink from the beginning. This would allow for so much more unique dialogue, and that might help develop these characters much more, considering they've had past interactions with Pink. On top of this, Pink, and maybe others, could be aware of the player and their decision to reincarnate everyone in order to play the game again, which would create another interesting, if unoriginal, moral dilemma. Even if it is unoriginal, it's much better than the game barely teasing at the idea in its last moments, only to never capitalize on it. In fact, we should probably get to that ending. The most representative parts of all the best and worst parts of Everhood is its main ending. The ending consists of 4 fights, which are accompanied by some of the game's best tracks, including its best track bar none, Euthanasia Roller Coaster. challenge provided by these fights is also quite enjoyable, continuing the consistent quality of the gameplay. There are even some story moments here that are great, especially the final farewell battle, which is the only time I felt any sort of connection to the game's characters. The way the game resolves its main story of the world of mortals is the most satisfying way it could have ended, despite its failings earlier in the game. But then they have to introduce Pink. Pink's connection to the player through the body of Red is how this ending addresses the meta-narrative side of the game. From what I can tell, Pink had the power to free everyone's souls, but they couldn't bring themselves to do it, which is why the player has to. The impact of this realization is neutered by the lackluster characterization and emotionality of the second half of the game, because the task of freeing the character's souls is not the arduous task the game attempts to set it up as. And on top of this, Pink is a character with so much boring logistical baggage that I just cannot bring myself to care about, since the ideas presented by the meta-narrative are so uninteresting. It is an absolute shame that this time was not put into the game's other story, where it was needed. This is why I find Everhood to be so frustrating. Its developers clearly put their hearts into this game, and a ton of that shows in its visuals, its gameplay, and its music. But as much as I want to, I cannot include story on that list. This game is getting updates that include dialogue proofreading, which is just unbelievable to me. I'm understanding of bug fixes and gameplay tweaks being made post-release, but story is the one thing that shouldn't have to be tampered with after release. And some of these typos are truly egregious, with one specific change that completely alters the meaning of a conversation by removing a single point of punctuation. It is baffling to me that this made it into the game's release build. It is so uniquely frustrating in this way. The more I think about it, the less I like it, and I really just need to stop. But I have to reiterate here that I do like Everhood. I didn't play it so many times because I didn't like it after all. I just had to go through all that because I've been sick of seeing people being entirely uncritical when looking at this game, and I really do want to see these ideas given the execution they truly deserve. I hope Everhood's creators go on to make more games with more great ideas and better execution with what they've learned from making this game. I really am excited to see what they come up with next. As a debut indie game, Everhood is absolutely a success, and I just hope that I don't come to consider it a lucky fluke in the future. This was a lot longer than it should have been, so much for it being a quick recommendation. At least I didn't have to bring up Undertale once, right? Wait, does that count? Ah,